When Taehyung mysteriously untags himself from a post with Jungkook, the world suspects drama, but the truth is far deeper and darker than anyone imagined. It started with the sound of a phone being thrown onto a velvet couch, the thud muffled but heavy with meaning. Jungkook stood motionless in the dimly lit hotel suite, chest rising and falling as he stared at the screen Taehyung had just shown him. On it, an Instagram post that had taken the fandom by storm, an image of the two of them at a private dinner after rehearsals, posted by one of the backup dancers. The caption was harmless, even affectionate. But something about the photo had made Taehyung freeze when he first saw it. And now, in the span of a heartbeat, he had untagged himself. "I didn't want people to assume," Taehyung had muttered, his voice tight, almost defensive. "Assume what?" Jungkook asked, his voice strained, almost cracking. Taehyung looked away, his jaw clenching as the city lights spilled through the high-rise window behind him. There was something in his silence that was louder than any answer. Jungkook stepped forward, but the distance between them felt wider than the room allowed. Their bond had always been complicated, a thing unspoken but pulsing beneath every glance, every note they sang beside each other on stage. Jungkook had grown used to watching Taehyung walk into a room and change the air, the gravity of it. He had memorized the cadence of Taehyung's laugh, the way his fingers fidgeted when he was anxious, how his eyes darted when he felt exposed. But now, there was something unfamiliar. A wall suddenly up, where before there had only been flickers of vulnerability. Outside, fans were still chanting their names from below the hotel, their voices echoing against glass, unaware of the tension slicing through the air inside. Jungkook rubbed the back of his neck, searching for a way in. "You could have told me first," he said quietly. Taehyung's laugh was soft, bitter. "Told you what? That I feel like a shadow in your story? That sometimes it feels like you're not even trying to see me anymore?" The words hit like a slap. Jungkook blinked, stunned, the confession unraveling everything he thought he understood. He had always thought their silences were comfortable, but maybe, to Taehyung, they had become something else, evidence of growing distance. In the weeks leading up to that night, the signs had been there. Taehyung had started lingering less in the dressing rooms. He left rehearsals early, declined dinners with vague excuses. Jungkook had noticed, but hadn't pushed, assuming exhaustion, needing space. They had always circled each other with a kind of intuitive rhythm, giving when needed, taking when offered. But now, the syncopation was gone. "I didn't untag myself because I'm ashamed," Taehyung added after a long pause. "I did it because I'm tired of being interpreted." Jungkook's chest tightened. By fans? By everyone. By you. There it was. Jungkook stepped back, his arms folding across his chest. Not out of anger, but as if holding himself together. He remembered a time backstage in Osaka when Taehyung had quietly leaned his head on Jungkook's shoulder and whispered, "Sometimes it's scary how much I trust you." It had felt sacred. Now it felt like a lie, buried under the weight of time and expectation. The fallout of the untagging rippled fast. Fans dissected every pixel of the photo, every timestamp, every expression. Conspiracy threads spiraled across platforms. Some speculated a feud, others cried heartbreak. Most couldn't decide whether it was a publicity stunt or a personal implosion. Inside their world, the truth was more fragile than any headline. That night, Taehyung slept in a separate suite for the first time in months. Their next rehearsal was clinical, professional, cordial, and yet every movement felt haunted. The choreographer sensed it. The staff whispered. Jimin kept glancing between the two of them as if trying to read the unsaid sentences floating in the air. Taehyung avoided eye contact. Jungkook kept his voice lower than usual. Their duet for the upcoming concert, meant to be a raw, emotional climax, suddenly felt like a performance without oxygen. Every harmony strained, every gesture practiced, not felt. After the third day of rehearsals, Jungkook waited near the elevator, watching Taehyung walk past without stopping. His hand lifted involuntarily, then dropped. His voice caught in his throat. "Do you regret it?" he finally asked, loud enough to stop Taehyung before the doors closed. Taehyung didn't turn around, but his fingers curled slightly at his side. "Regret what?" he replied without facing him. "The dinner. The photo. Everything before it." There was a beat of silence that felt infinite. Then the elevator doors slid shut. Jungkook stood alone in the hallway, the fluorescent lights above buzzing faintly. For the next few weeks they shared stages and camera frames, but not warmth. The world continued to see them through polished filters and curated smiles, but behind the scenes, it was all unraveling. Staff tried to bridge them with shared interviews, hoping the old spark would return. Management advised them to keep it clean, aware of how fragile public perception could be. But you can't fake a bond that's breaking from the inside. It was during a late-night live stream, alone in a quiet room, that Taehyung finally spoke, not about the untagging, but about silence, about what it meant to love someone deeply and still feel invisible. He never mentioned Jungkook by name, but the weight of it lingered. The fans cried, the comments flooded, but Jungkook stayed silent, until one day, he posted a photo. It was an old picture unposted until then of the two of them, on a rooftop laughing, unposed, unfiltered, no captions, no tags. But it didn't matter, because this time, Taehyung reposted it, without untagging, without fear, and somewhere in the quiet that followed, a healing began. Not loud, not dramatic, but real. Because some bonds don't need names, they just need time. The hallway outside the practice studio smelled faintly of sweat and lemon polish, the scent lingering from janitors cleaning late into the night. Jungkook stood, leaning against the wall, his cap pulled low, his hoodie zipped to his chin like armor. The rehearsal had ended an hour ago, but he hadn't moved. Not really. Not since Taehyung passed him with that usual elegance, shoulders back, jaw set, not even a flicker of acknowledgement in his eyes. Jungkook had replayed that elevator moment at least 30 times in his head. Each time, he imagined stopping the doors with his foot, reaching out, grabbing Taehyung's wrist and saying anything to make him turn around. But he hadn't. And now, everything that followed felt like fallout from that missed moment. Inside his pocket, Jungkook's phone buzzed. He didn't have to look. He already knew it wouldn't be Taehyung. The tension was leaking into everything. Interviews became stiff, almost surgical. Fans noticed the lack of glances, the missing eye contact, the space that used to be filled with silent conversations between them. Fan edits tried to compensate, threading together old footage with melancholic music and hopeful captions. But nostalgia was no cure for what was breaking in real time. Jimin was the first to bring it up. He cornered Jungkook backstage, where makeup lights hummed and costume racks rustled with motion. His eyes were sharp, not angry, but disappointed. "You're letting him drift," Jimin said simply, arms folded as he leaned against the vanity. Jungkook didn't answer, because deep down, he wasn't sure if it was really him who was letting go or Taehyung. "He thinks you've already chosen," Jimin added after a pause. Jungkook looked up then, startled. Chosen what? But Jimin just exhaled, as if the answer should have been obvious, and left the room. It gnawed at Jungkook for days. Every lyric he recorded suddenly carried too much weight. Every fan scream felt like noise pressing down on the silence inside him. He watched old videos late at night, unedited footage from their early years, grainy clips of him and Taehyung laughing in hotel corridors, whispering in corners during flights, bumping shoulders on stage. He remembered how easy it used to be. The weight of fame had changed many things, but this rupture felt personal. When their manager announced a surprise fan meeting in Busan, tension tightened. It would be their first unscripted appearance together since the untagging. The staff offered to rearrange seating. Jungkook refused. So did Taehyung. On the day of the event, the green room felt like a tomb. Everyone spoke in lowered voices. Taehyung sat by the mirror, scrolling silently. Jungkook's throat felt dry. A staff member handed him a bottle of water. He barely drank. When they finally stepped out to roaring cheers, the lights blinded everything except the tension between them. They smiled. They waved. They answered questions with charm. But anyone watching closely could feel it, two planets once in perfect orbit, now spinning just slightly off axis. Then came the question that wasn't supposed to be asked. A fan, maybe unaware, maybe bold, leaned into the mic and said, "That photo of you two went viral. Why did you untag Taehyung?" The silence was instant. Even the translator paused. Taehyung blinked. The smile on his face twitched, but didn't break. Jungkook's eyes snapped to him, breath caught in his chest. "I didn't like how I looked," Taehyung said after a beat. That's all. A half-lie. Enough to move on, but Jungkook knew better. And for the first time, the audience saw just a flicker of something raw passing between them, like electricity from a frayed wire. That night, Jungkook didn't go back to his hotel room. He walked for hours through Busan streets that buzzed with life and neon, his hoodie up, head down, trying to think, or not think. He ended up at the beach. The tide was low. The sand was cold. He texted Taehyung, "Are we really going to pretend this is nothing?" He watched the message go from delivered to read, but no reply came. The next morning, there was a new post on Taehyung's story. A black and white photo of the beach. No caption, no context. Jungkook stared at it until the screen dimmed. Days passed. Schedules bled into each other. Rehearsals, shoots, more silence. Until one day, in the middle of a dance practice, Taehyung's foot slipped. A bad landing. He fell. The room gasped. Jungkook ran to him before anyone else could. "Don't touch me," Taehyung hissed, pain flashing in his eyes, physical and something else. Jungkook froze, hands inches from him, but he didn't move back. "You can hate me," Jungkook said, his voice trembling, "but I'm not letting you fall alone." Taehyung's eyes shimmered, but he said nothing. He didn't push Jungkook away again. Not that day. And that was something. They began talking, haltingly, between breathless rehearsals, about choreography, then lyrics, then old memories, safe ground. Slowly, the words thickened with meaning. Jungkook found himself watching Taehyung's hands again, how they curled around the mic, how they fiddled with the edge of his shirt. He remembered the night in Tokyo when they'd sat on the balcony and talked about growing old and outliving the noise. He remembered Taehyung's soft voice saying, "I just want someone to still see me when all this fades." Maybe he hadn't seen him enough. Maybe the fame had pulled them apart in ways neither of them had noticed. They didn't talk about the post again. Not directly. But one night, Jungkook posted something else. A video, short, blurry. Them laughing at some inside joke years ago. The sound distorted, but the joy undeniable. He tagged Taehyung. This time, Taehyung didn't untag. Instead, he messaged 2 words. "Thank you." It wasn't a fix. Not completely. But when they walked out on stage a week later, their shoulders brushed. And when the final note hit and the lights dimmed, Jungkook reached for Taehyung's hand without thinking. Taehyung didn't pull away. The crowd never noticed the quiet exchange. But for the two of them, it was everything. In the end, the world would continue speculating, romanticizing, interpreting. But they had decided something important. That whatever the bond was, friendship, something more, something deeper, it was real. And it deserved to be protected. Not with denial, but with care. Even if that meant, sometimes, untagging for the sake of peace. And, sometimes, retagging. When peace had returned, the air inside the recording studio was unnaturally still. Even the usual hum of equipment and the low murmurs of producers behind the glass felt muted that afternoon. Jungkook sat in front of the mic, hands resting loosely on his knees. Eyes closed, not in calm, but in conflict. His voice had cracked 3 times during the same verse. A verse he'd written with Taehyung in mind, though he hadn't told anyone that. It wasn't even meant to be a song, not at first. It had started as a voice memo at 2 a.m., a line scribbled in a notebook he hadn't opened in months. The words were raw, too revealing, but something in him wanted it out. wanted it heard. He tried again. The backing track rolled in, soft piano chords over a slow, percussive heartbeat. His voice followed, trembling but honest. Each word a confession. Behind the glass, Jimin watched with a furrowed brow. He said nothing, but Yoongi could read the unease. After years together, they didn't need to speak to understand tension. And this wasn't just about music. This was something personal bleeding into the performance. Something that no amount of vocal warm-ups could smooth out. When the take ended, silence filled the room again. Jungkook didn't look up. Jimin clicked the intercom. "You want a break?" Jungkook nodded once. Wordless. He pulled the headphones off slowly and stepped out of the booth, brushing past Yoongi with a quiet thanks. He didn't go far, just into the hallway, where the muffled sounds of the track could no longer reach him. He leaned against the wall, eyes burning, not from exhaustion, but from everything he hadn't said out loud. It had been weeks since Taehyung responded to his story. Weeks since that handhold on stage. Since then, they'd stayed professional, warm even, but something remained broken beneath the surface. Smiles with missing sincerity. Conversations with cautious edges. They were trying, but it still felt like walking on cracked glass. What Jungkook hadn't told anyone was that he saw the DM. The one Taehyung had sent to a private account the night before the untagging. A message never meant for him to find. The words haunted him still. I feel like a side character in my own story. Jungkook didn't know how to respond to that kind of pain. Not then. Not now. The studio door opened behind him, and Jimin stepped out with 2 bottles of water. He offered one without a word. Jungkook accepted it, taking a sip just to occupy his hands. "You're writing about him," Jimin said finally. It wasn't a question. Jungkook let out a hollow laugh. "Am I that obvious?" "You sing like you're bleeding," Jimin murmured. "So yeah." They stood in silence for a moment, the hallway lights casting long shadows across the floor. Finally, Jungkook spoke again. "I thought we were okay. After the concert. After the post. But he's still distant." Jimin leaned against the wall beside him, thoughtful. "Maybe because nothing was really said. You both just performed healing. But you didn't actually talk." Jungkook looked down at the floor, jaw tight. "I don't know what to say anymore." "Then stop saying things," Jimin said quietly. "Start doing." And maybe that was what finally moved something in Jungkook. That night, instead of going home after the session, he went to the place they used to go when things got overwhelming, a secluded hill just outside the city, where the skyline stretched far and the stars sometimes dared to show. It was cold, and the wind stung his cheeks. But he stayed, waiting, hoping. He didn't text Taehyung. He didn't post. But he knew somehow that Taehyung would know he was there. He always had. 2 hours passed. Jungkook nearly gave up. But then, headlights cut through the dark, and a car door slammed softly behind him. Footsteps. No words. Taehyung came to stand beside him, hands buried deep in his coat pockets, eyes forward. Jungkook's throat tightened. "You came." Taehyung shrugged, but his voice was soft. "I always come here when I need to remember who I am." Jungkook nodded slowly. "Me too." A beat passed. "I didn't mean to make you feel like a side character," Jungkook said. The words were quiet but steady. "I just didn't know how to stop being the main one." Taehyung's eyes flicked toward him then. Not with anger, with something more vulnerable. "I wasn't angry because of the post," he said. "I was angry because I realized I stopped expecting anything from you. I stopped believing you'd see me again." Jungkook turned to face him fully, expression crumbling. "I never stopped seeing you. I just got blinded by everything else." Taehyung looked down, his breath fogging in the air. "So what now?" Jungkook didn't answer right away. He stepped closer, slowly, hesitantly, until their shoulders touched again. "We stop pretending," he said, "and we rebuild, even if it's slow." Taehyung didn't reply, but he didn't move away either. They stayed like that until the cold no longer mattered. After that night, things didn't magically fix themselves, but they shifted. Taehyung came to the studio more often, not always to record, sometimes just to sit in the corner and sketch in his notebook. Jungkook stopped checking his phone during breaks and started watching him instead. The distance shrank. They shared a live again, just the two of them. Laughter wasn't forced. Questions were answered together. They didn't speak about the past directly, but their energy said what words hadn't yet found shape for. Fans noticed. The timeline healed, but what mattered most wasn't online. It was backstage after their first comeback stage in months. They sat side by side in the makeup chairs, still flushed with adrenaline, still catching their breath. The staff filtered out slowly. Jimin passed behind them and caught Jungkook's eye in the mirror, smiling knowingly. Taehyung reached into his pocket and slid a folded piece of paper across the counter. Jungkook blinked, confused, then opened it. Inside was a printout of the original photo, the one that caused it all. But now, across the top, Taehyung had written, "This time, don't forget to tag me back." Jungkook's laugh broke the silence. It echoed through the room. And this time, Taehyung laughed too. The morning after the laughter echoed through the backstage room, Jungkook woke before his alarm. The light filtering through the hotel curtains was soft, golden, wrapping the room in a quiet glow that felt too delicate to disturb. He sat up slowly, his fingers brushing over the folded photo still resting on the bedside table. Taehyung's handwriting scrawled across the top in familiar ink. It wasn't just a message, it was a reopening, a door unlatched. An unspoken forgiveness offered, fragile and real. Jungkook stared at it for a while, breathing in silence. For the first time in weeks, the ache in his chest was not from absence or confusion. It was a bittersweet warmth, like coming home after wandering too long in the cold. He picked up the photo, slid it carefully into the back pocket of his notebook, and stood. His schedule that day was packed: interviews, rehearsals, a live radio segment, but his mind wasn't on any of it. Not really. His thoughts stayed with Taehyung, the way his eyes had softened during that last moment. The way his laughter sounded lighter, less guarded, more like the Taehyung he remembered from those nights on the rooftop years ago, when the world still felt new and theirs to claim. By the time Jungkook arrived at the set for the variety shoot later that morning, Taehyung was already there, lounging on the couch with a cup of tea balanced in one hand and his sketch pad in the other. Their eyes met briefly across the room. Taehyung didn't smile right away, but there was no ice in his gaze, just quiet acknowledgement, an invitation to be normal, or at least to try. The shoot was lighthearted, filled with challenges and games. They were paired together for most of it, something the producers had done deliberately, likely hoping to reignite fan engagement. But the camera wasn't the only reason they stood side by side more easily that day. Jungkook found himself glancing at Taehyung mid-challenge, watching the way he grinned at the ridiculous questions, how his shoulders relaxed as the tension lifted from the room. And when Taehyung leaned close during a game and whispered something under his breath that made Jungkook choke on laughter, they both froze for a second. Not from awkwardness, but from the realization of how much they'd missed each other. That night, back in the hotel, Jungkook sat alone on the balcony with a guitar resting on his lap. The city buzzed below him, but his fingers were gentle against the strings, coaxing out a melody he hadn't planned. He hummed softly, then paused to scribble a few lines in his notebook. The lyrics came easier now, not because the pain had vanished, but because it had found shape and named, acknowledged. There was something freeing in that. His phone buzzed. A text. Taehyung, you free tomorrow morning? Jungkook stared at the screen, unsure whether to smile or be cautious. He typed back. Jungkook. Depends. What's the plan? Taehyung. Something quiet. Just us. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, they met at the park near the Han River hoodies. Pulled low, sunglasses shielding tired eyes, hats casting shadows that helped them blend into the still sleeping city. They didn't speak much as they walked, just moved side by side, their steps sinking over time. When they reached the edge of the water, Taehyung sat on a bench and pulled something from his coat pocket. It was a small Polaroid camera, old and chipped, edges taped from overuse. You still carry that? Jungkook asked, surprised. Taehyung shrugged. Never stopped. He snapped a picture without warning. Jungkook blinked at the flash, then laughed. That one's gonna be awful. Taehyung didn't respond. He just waited for the photo to develop, then pass it over. The image was slightly off-center, a little blurry, but something about the tilt of Jungkook's head, the hint of a smile on his lips, it felt honest. Unstaged, like truth. I want to start again, Taehyung said after a moment. Not erase everything, just start forward, from here. Jungkook's fingers closed around the Polaroid. I want that too. They sat in silence after that. The kind that didn't require fixing. Over the next few weeks, that quiet understanding became the foundation they built on. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of hesitation, pauses in conversation, near-missed eye contact, but the effort was mutual now. The energy changed. It was no longer about performing closeness. It was about rediscovering it. During one rehearsal, while working through a particularly intimate stage sequence, the choreographer paused them mid-routine. Try it again. But this time actually look at each other. They did. And something cracked open. Because when Jungkook's gaze locked with Taehyung's, something passed between them that hadn't in months. A shared memory. A silent apology. A promise. No one else in the room noticed the subtle shift. But they did. The performance that night made headlines. Not for the vocals or the production value, though those were excellent. But because of a moment mid-song when Jungkook reached out without choreography, and Taehyung took his hand. Just briefly, but with enough weight to make fans gasp. The footage looped endlessly online. Analysts speculated symbolism. Shippers went wild.
But the truth was simpler. It was two people saying, I see you. They started walking home from rehearsals together again. Not every night, but enough that it became a rhythm. Sometimes they spoke about the past, carefully, like navigating cracked glass. Other times they spoke about the future. One evening, Jungkook asked, would you ever want to do another subunit, just us? Taehyung tilted his head. Why? Jungkook hesitated. Because I think the last one, we weren't really ourselves. Taehyung smiled, soft and sad. Yeah, we were trying too hard to be what everyone else saw in us. So let's do one where we're not, Jungkook said, where it's messy, honest. Taehyung didn't answer immediately. But the next morning, he sent a demo. A rough voice memo, just guitar, a melody he'd written alone. Jungkook listened to it 6 times before responding. Jungkook, let's make something honest then. They started writing late at night, often in hotel rooms or borrowed studios. Sometimes they argued over chords. Sometimes they laughed so hard they had to stop recording. The track took shape slowly, with pieces of them sewn into every note. They called the song Backspace. Not because they wanted to delete anything, but because sometimes you need to pause, breathe, and write again, knowing what came before but choosing what comes next. When it dropped, it wasn't promoted as a comeback. No grand rollout, just a post, a link, a caption. This time we're not tagging anyone. You'll know if it's for you. Fans wept. The comment sections overflowed, but the real moment happened off-screen. In the green room after a low-key radio session, Taehyung tossed his phone on the couch and leaned back. Jungkook looked over. You okay? Taehyung nodded. I think I actually am. And for the first time in months, Jungkook believed it. He smiled, then reached over, pulled out his own phone and took a picture. No filters, no poses. Just Taehyung resting, honest. He posted it with a single caption. Still here. This time, he didn't need to tag him. Because Taehyung reshared it with a heart. And the world, for once, didn't need to speculate. Because they had stopped pretending. And started again, together. The studio lights had all dimmed except for one, a warm overhead glow that cast golden shadows across the polished floor. The last few crew members were packing up in the distance, voices low, footsteps soft against the glossy surface. Jungkook remained seated at the piano in the far corner, fingers tracing slow, aimless patterns across the keys. He wasn't playing anything, just feeling, listening to the quiet that followed release. Behind him, the door creaked open. Taehyung entered without a word, hands in his coat pockets, scarf still wound loosely around his neck. He didn't make his presence known right away, didn't need to. Jungkook felt him in the room the way you feel a memory before it surfaces. Without looking back, Jungkook said, "We haven't finished it." Taehyung stepped forward, his shoes echoing softly. "Finished what?" "This song, this story, whatever this has been between us." Jungkook's voice was gentle but charged, as if he had been holding that sentence behind his teeth for too long. Taehyung came to stand beside him at the piano, his eyes flicking down to the keys. "Maybe some stories aren't meant to finish." "Maybe," Jungkook agreed, "but they should still be told properly." Taehyung tilted his head, curious. "And how would you tell it?" Jungkook paused, then he played, a new progression half-written, raw, emotionally jagged. Taehyung closed his eyes, listening not just to the notes but to the unsaid behind them. It was all there. The tension, the heartbreak, the slow rebuild, a melody that didn't resolve in the usual place because neither had they. Taehyung slid onto the bench beside him. "Play that again." Jungkook did. This time, Taehyung hummed along, finding the edges of the tune, soft and low. His voice melted into the music like mist into dusk. When the last note lingered, fading into the corners of the room, they didn't speak. They didn't have to. Outside, the city breathed with its usual rhythm, cars passing, distant sirens, the low thrum of night. But in that studio, time was still. The air was heavier, but not in a suffocating way, in a sacred way, like something had finally been honored. In the following days, the schedule picked up again. They moved through events and tapings with a renewed calm between them. They still gave space, still operated like two distinct forces orbiting the same sun, but the gravity had shifted, no longer repelling, attracting quietly. Jungkook noticed the difference in small things. Taehyung texting first, sitting closer during makeup sessions, humming songs Jungkook had written, watching him a little too long in the dressing room mirror before quickly looking away. And Taehyung noticed Jungkook stopping mid-sentence just to listen to the way he laughed, how he reached out absent-mindedly during group photos, just to make sure they touched, how he remembered the details Taehyung had forgotten he'd shared. The fandom noticed too, but for once their theories weren't wild, they weren't wrong. It was Jimin again who brought it up over dinner one night. The restaurant was tucked away in a quiet Seoul alley, warm and dim, the kind of place where time stretched. He swirled the last of his drink and looked between them, smile lazy but knowing. "You too," he said, "you're not what you were before." Jungkook raised an eyebrow. "Is that good or bad?" "Neither," Jimin said, "but it's real and that's rarer." They didn't answer, but both of them carried that comment with them quietly. One night after a performance, they found themselves back on the rooftop they used to sneak onto during the early years. The air was colder now. They were older. The skyline had changed, some buildings taller, some gone. But the stars remained shy and scattered just like before. Taehyung leaned over the rail. "You remember that night we made that pact?" Jungkook blinked. "Which one?" "The one where we said no matter what happened, we'd never let the world change what we saw in each other." Jungkook smiled faintly. "I remember. I also remember we broke that pact." "Yeah," Taehyung murmured, "we did." They stood in the silence of that acknowledgement. Then Taehyung added, "But maybe we can make a new one." Jungkook turned toward him. "Okay." Taehyung held out his pinky. Jungkook laughed softly, then wrapped his around it. "No more pretending," Taehyung said. "No more performing closeness," Jungkook agreed. "No more disappearing without explanation. No more silence when it matters most. They linked their fingers tighter, a pact reborn. Then Taehyung leaned his head against Jungkook's shoulder, not romantically, not dramatically, just naturally. Jungkook didn't move, just let him rest. And when a plane passed overhead, trailing its blinking lights across the deep navy sky, neither of them wished to be anywhere else. They released the final version of Backspace a month later, a surprise drop, no teasers, just a post. The cover art was simple, two silhouettes facing each other, backlit by sunset, details indistinct. The lyrics told a story that needed no explanation. It charted within an hour. Critics called it the most vulnerable piece they had ever written. But the real review came in the form of a message Taehyung received from a private number. One line. "I see you again." Taehyung smiled when he read it. Didn't reply. Just looked up across the table where Jungkook was editing a behind-the-scenes video and whispered, "Same." They didn't need a tag to know it was theirs, not anymore. LANJUTKAN, EPSDI, ATAS DNGN, MENGUNAKN 10,000 kata. Dan LANJUTKAN TAMPA POINDI ATAS. SRTA HILANJKAN kata 10,000 Dan HILANJKAN TULISAN episode. Dan LANJUTKAN DNGN PANJANG. Dan MENGUNAKN BAHASA INGGRIS. Of course, here is the long-form continuation of the previous narrative, written in immersive, uninterrupted cinematic English prose, continuing the emotional story of Jungkook and Taehyung, with no episode labels, no word count references, and no point formatting, just fluid narrative depth, emotion, and packing as requested. They didn't announce it. There was no headline, no backstage confession, no moment caught by a microphone left on by mistake, but the change between them was unmistakable. Where silence had once drawn boundaries, it now offered space, and where glances once hesitated, they lingered, soft, slow, meaningful. The kind of look that doesn't ask for permission, only recognition. Taehyung started arriving early to rehearsals again, not to warm up but to sit near the back and watch. Sometimes sketching, sometimes just observing, and Jungkook in turn began staying later. His footsteps echoing long after the rest of the crew had gone, his fingers restless on piano keys, waiting to hear the door creak open behind him. They no longer rushed toward each other like before, but they also no longer ran away. In an interview recorded behind the stage of a winter show, one of the staff members, too young to know the entire history, too new to understand the context, made a passing comment about how V and Jungkook always seemed to move like one breath. Jungkook had smiled softly at that, not smug, not proud, just quietly acknowledging that yes, maybe that had always been true, they had only forgotten how to inhale together. They weren't trying to replicate the past anymore. They weren't chasing the warmth of old hotel rooms or the thrill of shared secrets whispered into microphones between songs. This was different, slower, more cautious, but also more real. One night after an exhausting shoot that had drained them both, Jungkook suggested they go for a drive. No destination, no cameras, no handlers. Taehyung didn't even ask where, they just got into the car. The city lights faded behind them as Jungkook took the coastal highway, the road curling along the sea like a ribbon of silver beneath the stars. Neither of them spoke for miles. It wasn't uncomfortable. It just was. Eventually, Taehyung rolled down his window and let the cold wind rush over his face. He closed his eyes, the salt in the air tugging something loose in his chest. Jungkook glanced over. "What are you thinking about?" Taehyung smiled faintly. "How we used to dream about this life, then got it, and nearly drowned in it." Jungkook's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "We still might." "Maybe," Taehyung replied, "but at least now we drown together." Jungkook laughed quietly like it hurt a little. "You're so dramatic." "Not dramatic," Taehyung said, "just honest." They parked by the cliffside, where the waves crashed with rhythmic fury against the rocks below. Jungkook stepped out, hoodie drawn up, arms folded against the cold. Taehyung joined him, standing close enough to feel his warmth but not quite touching. "You know," Jungkook said, eyes scanning the dark horizon, "when you untagged yourself, I didn't just feel exposed, I felt erased." Taehyung blinked, startled by the vulnerability in those words. "I didn't know how to tell you then," Jungkook continued, his voice low, raw, "but that photo, it was the first time in a long time I felt like we were back, even for a second, and then it was gone." "I didn't untag because of you," Taehyung said. "I untagged because of me." Jungkook turned to look at him, searching his face in the dim light. "I needed to figure out who I was without being half of something the world romanticized. I needed space, not from you, from them, from their expectations of what we were supposed to be." Jungkook nodded slowly, understanding dawning like sunlight through fog. "Do you still need that space?" Taehyung looked at him, really looked. "No," he said simply. "Now I need truth, and I need someone who sees me even when I'm not trying to be seen." "I see you," Jungkook whispered. "I know." Back in Seoul, the days moved faster. Promotions, schedules, flights, comebacks. But between the chaos, they found small sanctuaries, in shared car rides, in passing post-its stuck to dressing room mirrors, in glances across crowded green rooms that said more than words could carry. They began planning something new, not an album, not a tour, something quieter. A project that didn't need fanfare. They called it The Archive. It was a collection of moments, songs, visuals, writings, sketches, letters that never made it to stage or screen. Pieces of them that were too soft, too strange, too personal to fit into the polished narrative. It wasn't for charts. It wasn't for headlines. It was for themselves. And for the fans who had loved them even through the silence. When they announced it with a single black and white photo, Jungkook sitting on the floor, barefoot, guitar in lap, Taehyung curled beside him, sketching on Jungkook's bare shoulder, the internet broke. But they didn't respond to the noise. Not this time. Because the real response came in the way fans whispered about it, the way they wrote letters about healing, the way they cried over a 2-minute voice note of Jungkook reading a poem Taehyung had written 5 years ago. One evening, after reviewing the final cut of a short film from the archive, just grainy footage of them on a beach, saying nothing, just walking, Taehyung turned to Jungkook and asked, "Do you regret how far we let it drift?" Jungkook didn't answer right away. "Then I regret not fighting harder, but I don't regret the drift. It showed us what we were missing." Taehyung nodded. "It made us choose each other again." And that choice, made not under stage lights or in front of an audience, but in quiet, private moments, meant everything. They still had their lives, their fame, their separate ambitions. But they also had this. Something undefined, unlabeled, but present and real. Some days they called it friendship. Some days they didn't name it at all. But every time Jungkook tagged Taehyung in a photo now, Taehyung never removed it. Not once. Because finally, they weren't afraid of being seen. The snow had started falling again. Soft, slow flakes drifted under the street lamps like confetti from the heavens, turning the quiet city into a dreamscape. Jungkook stood beneath the awning of a small bakery that had closed for the night, watching the snow settle on the sidewalk and melt against the skin of his outstretched hand. The sky above was heavy with stillness, the kind that made you reflect, the kind that made you remember. Behind him, Taehyung emerged from the shadows, his coat unbuttoned, scarf loosely wrapped, eyes shimmering with the golden glow of the streetlight. He had walked in silence, letting the rhythm of his steps match Jungkook's breath as he stood there, waiting. "You always used to love snow," Taehyung said softly. Jungkook didn't turn around. "I still do. It makes everything quieter." There was a pause before Taehyung replied, "Not everything." Jungkook glanced at him now, eyes unreadable but full. No, not everything. Taehyung stepped beside him close enough that their shoulders brushed again. The contact was small but grounding, a reminder that they were still here, still real. It had been 3 months since the archive. 3 months since they decided to give the world only what was true, not manufactured closeness, not the illusion of healing, but the messiness of it, the beauty of repair, slow and imperfect. In that time they had grown used to new rituals, not the kind fans could see, but rituals only they knew. Jungkook leaving tea on Taehyung's windowsill before early morning shoots. Taehyung sending voice notes at 2 a.m. with strange melodies he wasn't sure how to finish. A photo sent without comment. A door knocked on softly, not waiting to be answered, just letting the sound linger. And now here they were again, surrounded by snow, the world too quiet, their hearts too loud. Jungkook finally broke the silence. Do you ever wonder what it would have looked like if we had never drifted? Taehyung exhaled slowly, his breath a cloud in the winter air. I used to, but now I think, maybe the version where we break and rebuild is better. Why? Because we had to choose it, again and again, not because the cameras were rolling, but because it mattered. Jungkook let those words sink in, felt them settle in his bones. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The edges were worn, the ink slightly smudged. I wrote something, he said quietly. Taehyung took the paper, careful with it like it was something sacred. He unfolded it, read. It wasn't a song, it wasn't even poetry. Just a letter. You were the silence I feared and the song I couldn't finish. You were the missing verse, the line I skipped because I was too afraid to hear it out loud. But now I think I'm ready to listen again, to write again, with you. Taehyung folded the letter back with trembling fingers. He didn't speak at first, just looked up at Jungkook, eyes glassy but steady. I wrote something too, he said. Jungkook looked surprised. You did. Taehyung reached into his own pocket and pulled out a small sketchpad. He opened to the last page. It was a drawing, 2 silhouettes seated at a piano, one playing, one listening. Their heads leaned slightly toward each other. No names, no faces, but unmistakably them. Jungkook stared at it, his throat tightened. Taehyung closed the pad and slipped it into Jungkook's hands. It's yours. They stood there a moment longer, then Jungkook spoke, voice soft. Come with me. He didn't wait for an answer. He started walking and Taehyung followed. Snow crunching underfoot. They ended up at the dorm, their old one, long since empty but still maintained by staff who couldn't quite let go of the memories stored inside its walls. Jungkook had asked for the keys weeks ago, unsure of why. Now he knew. Inside, nothing had changed. The same low ceilings, the same scuffed floorboards, the same couch where they used to fall asleep watching movies on mute. The smell of old pine from the wooden cabinets still clung to the air. Jungkook stepped into the room they used to share, turned on the lamp by the bed. The golden light flickered, then held steady. This place, he said, running his fingers over the edge of the desk, saw everything. Our beginnings, our fears, our silence. Taehyung sat on the bed slowly, and now it sees this. Jungkook joined him. Neither of them spoke for a long time. There was nothing urgent left to say, only truth left to feel. And then Jungkook began to hum. A soft melody, unfinished but hopeful. Taehyung joined in, harmonizing instinctively, their voices blending like they always had, seamless and aching. No mic, no audience, just them. They sang until their voices faded into whispers, until the night curled around the walls like a blanket. Eventually, Jungkook laid back on the bed, eyes on the ceiling. I'm not scared anymore, he said. Taehyung turned his head to look at him. Of what? Of losing you. Taehyung smiled gently. You didn't lose me, you just forgot how to reach me. And now? You never stopped reaching. They stayed like that, until sleep tugged at the edges of their limbs. The snow outside kept falling. And inside that old dorm, two boys who had once feared the quiet learned how to let it sing. It was raining the night they returned to the practice room, not for a scheduled rehearsal, not for a performance, just the two of them, seeking something they couldn't explain but had both been aching for. The building was nearly empty, only a faint hum of lights and the distant echo of someone closing a door on another floor. Jungkook had messaged Taehyung a single line, "Come to the room. I left the lights on." And Taehyung had come, hair damp from the mist outside, his expression unreadable under the hood of his sweatshirt. But his eyes were awake in a way they hadn't been in months. The wooden floors creaked beneath them as they stood facing the mirrored wall. No music played, no choreography waiting, just the echo of memories suspended in the space between them. This was the room where so much of it had begun when they were boys, still learning how to move, how to breathe, how to trust. Before the cameras, before the silence, before the untagging. Jungkook stepped forward first. He didn't speak. He simply raised his arm, slow, deliberate, and let it move through a familiar pattern. His fingers slicing the air in a motion Taehyung had memorized years ago. The beginning of a routine they had performed hundreds of times but had never finished together since. Taehyung moved in instinctively, catching the rhythm like a shadow returning to its source. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their bodies remembered what their words had struggled to hold. They danced, not for precision, not for perfection, but for something purer, something almost like grace. Every step was an apology, every breath a reconciliation. And when the music finally came, quiet, playing from Jungkook's phone resting on the floor, it was Backspace. Their version, raw, the demo, not the final cut. The one where Taehyung's voice cracks on the bridge, where Jungkook forgets a line and laughs under his breath. The one they never shared, the version only they knew. They danced to that, to the imperfection, to the truth. By the time the last note faded, Taehyung was standing inches from Jungkook, breath shallow, eyes shining with unshed words. Jungkook didn't ask what he was thinking. He didn't need to. Instead, he whispered, "Let's not lose this again." Taehyung nodded once, and in that movement, Jungkook saw everything, forgiveness, hope, and something that was quite love but not far from it. After that night, something shifted permanently. They didn't try to return to how things used to be. Instead, they built something new. They started appearing together in quiet ways, not viral live streams or heavily edited appearances, but real moments. A behind-the-scenes photo of Taehyung tying Jungkook's shoelace mid-laugh. A candid clip of Jungkook brushing lint from Taehyung's shoulder before a shoot. A blurry image of the two of them at a cafe in Daegu, sitting side by side, phones forgotten, heads tilted together in deep conversation. When asked about it in interviews, they didn't deflect, but they didn't explain either. Taehyung simply said, "Some connections don't need labels." And Jungkook added, "We're still writing the story together." Fans didn't ask for more. They didn't have to. One morning, Jungkook woke to find a note slipped under his hotel door. No envelope, just folded paper. The handwriting was unmistakably Taehyung's. "There's something I never told you. During the weeks we weren't speaking, I used to call your number and hang up after one ring. I didn't want you to answer. I just needed to know you were still there." Jungkook pressed the letter to his chest. Later that day, he sent a voice message in response. He didn't say much. Only this: "I heard every ring. I just didn't know it was you." The weeks that followed felt like healing in motion. They worked on a short film for the archive, a final piece to close the project. It was filmed on a handheld camera, just the two of them walking through Seoul at night, sharing memories. They passed the camera back and forth, sometimes talking to it, sometimes not. Sometimes filming each other, sometimes themselves. It wasn't scripted, it wasn't polished, but it was honest. The final frame showed them on the rooftop of their old dorm again. This time seated side by side, watching the city lights flicker like distant stars. Taehyung turned the camera toward Jungkook and asked, "If you could say one thing to your younger self, what would it be?" Jungkook thought for a moment. Then he said, "Don't be afraid to speak first." The camera panned to Taehyung, who smiled gently, eyes soft. "And you?" Taehyung looked straight into the lens. "I'd say wait, he'll come back, and when he does, don't let him go." The film ended there. No credits. No title. Just silence. And then the sound of a door closing gently, followed by footsteps walking away together. It became the most viewed piece in the archive. But more than the views, it was the messages that mattered. Hundreds of thousands of comments poured in, not just from fans, but from people who had lost someone and didn't know how to rebuild, from those who had drifted and hoped for return, from those who finally realized what it meant to truly be seen. And in the quiet corners of the internet, under usernames no one knew belonged to them, Jungkook and Taehyung read every single one. They didn't always reply, but they listened, because now they knew the weight of silence, and they no longer feared it. They had turned it into music, into motion, into memory, and most of all into a beginning. Spring arrived without warning. The city transformed in slow, tender pulses. Cold asphalt softened under budding cherry blossoms, the air lighter, carrying warmth that hadn't been felt in months. Even the wind changed its voice, less harsh, more curious. On one such morning, sunlight pooled through the cafe windows like melted gold. Jungkook sat by the glass, hood down, hair still damp from his rushed shower, stirring the same cup of black coffee he hadn't sipped yet. He was waiting. Not out of obligation, not because of some agreement. He was waiting for Taehyung. And there, at 9:12 a.m. sharp, Taehyung appeared, shoulders draped in an oversized coat, sunglasses too large for this early hour, but still carrying that unbothered grace that made people turn and stare. He walked in like he had walked into every memory Jungkook held of him, soft at the edges, yet completely unforgettable. "You're early," Taehyung said as he sat down. "You're exactly on time," Jungkook replied. The silence between them now wasn't awkward, it was familiar, safe, a kind of shared language that didn't rely on noise. They had started meeting like this once a week. No cameras, no staff, no shared itinerary, just the two of them relearning each other outside the edges of performance and expectation. Taehyung reached into his coat pocket and placed something on the table, a small, square envelope, black wax seal, no name. Jungkook looked at it, then him. "What is this?" Taehyung shrugged. "You'll find out." "Now?" Taehyung tilted his head, smiling. "No, later, when you're alone. You have to open it when it's raining." Jungkook frowned, amused. "Is this a game?" "It's a message," Taehyung said, "but not one you're ready for right now." Jungkook didn't push. He just tucked the envelope into the inside pocket of his jacket, the weight of it somehow heavier than its size allowed. They talked about other things then. Music, a new show they both hated, Jimin's impulsive decision to dye his hair blue again. But beneath it all, the letter burned like a secret, and Jungkook couldn't stop wondering what words Taehyung had chosen to seal in silence. Days passed. Schedules returned. Life tugged them into separate directions again. But the letter remained, folded, untouched, until the rain came. It was late, closer to midnight than evening, and Jungkook was alone in his apartment, watching the city disappear behind a curtain of silver. The rain was soft but persistent, tapping against the windows like a memory trying to be let in. He pulled the envelope from his drawer. His hands were steady, but his breath was. The seal cracked. The paper unfolded. And there, in Taehyung's handwriting, sharp and flowing like a song written mid-dream, were these words. "There are versions of us I still visit in my sleep, ones where you looked back when I walked away, Ones where I spoke up sooner. Versions where we were braver at the same time. But none of them feel as real as this one. Because here, in this version, we lost each other. And still found our way back. I'd rather be with you in imperfection than without you in perfection. Jungkook closed his eyes. The rain became louder somehow. He stood, grabbed his coat, and left. He didn't text Taehyung, didn't call. He knew where he would be. The rooftop. That rooftop. Always that rooftop. The city blurred around him as he ran, past empty streets and flickering neon signs, past sleeping buildings and traffic lights blinking yellow into no one. When he reached the rooftop, Taehyung was already there. Of course he was. He stood at the edge, shirt clinging to him from the rain, hair dripping, head tilted back as if waiting to be cleansed. Jungkook didn't say anything. He just walked up behind him and wrapped his arms around his waist. Taehyung didn't flinch. Didn't turn. He just leaned back into him, letting out a breath like it had been caught in his chest for years. I got your letter, Jungkook whispered into the rain. I hoped you would, Taehyung said. They stood there, soaked and breathless and entirely too full of feeling. Jungkook buried his face in Taehyung's shoulder. Let's stop pretending that what we have isn't everything. Taehyung closed his eyes, even if the world keeps asking what we are. They'll ask, Jungkook said, let them. And what will we tell them? That we are something, Jungkook said, and that's enough. Taehyung turned then, finally slowly, and looked at him. His eyes weren't guarded anymore. They weren't questioning. They just were. And Jungkook kissed him. Not as a performance, not as a confession, but as a continuation of everything they had been too afraid to admit. When they pulled apart, Taehyung laughed, wet and breathless. You're late, he whispered. Jungkook smiled against his lips. You waited. I always would. And from that night forward, the silence between them held no more fear. Only meaning. Only promise. They didn't come out with a statement. They didn't need to. Their music spoke for them. Their eyes on stage told stories only the bravest fans could interpret. The way their hands brushed. The way their voices blended with more than just harmony. The way their names, spoken together, sounded like an answer. The fandom knew. And those who didn't understand didn't matter. Because the ones who truly loved them, really loved them, had seen the arc of it all. From the untagging, to the silence, to the night in the rain, to now. And in the end, it wasn't about defining it. It was about living it. Honestly, fearlessly. Together, the next morning the rain had stopped, but the air still carried its scent, fresh, heavy, alive. Jungkook woke to the soft hush of silence, the kind that only followed after something important had been spoken or broken or healed. Taehyung was lying beside him, not quite asleep, not fully awake either, eyes closed but his hand gently resting over Jungkook's chest, as if feeling the rhythm of something that had always been there between them but had finally settled into something they could trust. Jungkook didn't move for a long time. He just stared at the ceiling, the way sunlight streaked through half-closed blinds in lines that mapped across Taehyung's skin. He thought about every version of their story, every moment they'd almost fallen apart, every word they didn't say, every picture taken where one of them smiled and the other almost did. The world had always tried to write their story for them, stitching headlines out of half-truths and photos cropped at just the wrong angle. But here, in this room, in this silence, there was a version of their story that no one else could edit. When Taehyung opened his eyes, the first thing he did was smile. Not a tired smile, not a performance. Just a smile, real and open and quiet. Jungkook turned slightly to face him. Did we do it? He asked, voice still thick with sleep. Do what? Taehyung murmured. Find our way back. Taehyung's thumb brushed over Jungkook's ribs, tracing nothing in particular. Maybe we didn't go back. Maybe we just started again. Jungkook nodded, accepting the thought like a prayer. Then let's start properly. They didn't speak for a while after that. They didn't need to. Words weren't the only way they communicated anymore. It was in the way Jungkook placed his hand over Taehyung's, in the way Taehyung reached to brush hair from Jungkook's eyes without thinking, in the way their legs tangled as they shifted under the sheets, clumsy and natural. Later that day, they returned to the studio, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. They moved slowly through the glass doors, nodding to the familiar faces that had witnessed their unraveling and didn't ask questions. Inside, the soundboard blinked like it remembered them. The couch still sagged in the same spot. The same note Taehyung had stuck on the wall months ago still hung crooked. Art only lives if it's honest. They recorded something that afternoon. It wasn't meant for release. It wasn't even titled. Just the two of them sitting side by side on the floor, guitar between them, one mic in front. They played around with chords. Taehyung hummed a melody. Jungkook added a line he'd scribbled on his hand earlier that morning. It was simple, rough, unfinished. But when they listened back to it, something in their expressions changed. Because it sounded like them. Not just as artists, but as people. That night they ordered takeout and ate in the corner of the studio, legs stretched out, surrounded by tangled cables and lyric sheets and laughter that returned without warning. Jungkook reached for a fortune cookie, cracked it open, and pulled out a slip of paper. "The answers you seek will come when the questions no longer matter," he read aloud. Taehyung smirked. "That's a little on the nose." "Maybe," Jungkook said, "but it's not wrong." Their relationship changed after that, not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, irreversible ways. They stopped correcting people when assumptions were made. They stopped pretending not to notice the glances during interviews, the knowing smiles exchanged when one of them was mentioned. Jungkook started wearing a necklace Taehyung gave him on his birthday. Taehyung stopped hiding the wallpaper on his phone, a candid photo of them, taken in the green room, where Jungkook was sleeping on his shoulder, and Taehyung wasn't even looking at the camera, just at him. They weren't hiding anymore. Not because they had decided to come out in some grand announcement, but because they'd finally accepted that what they were didn't need to be explained. They were still themselves, still individuals, still artists, still brothers to their group, still fiercely protective of the bond that had started as friendship, grown into something confusing, and finally bloomed into something too honest to categorize. And perhaps most importantly, they had stopped fearing the silence between them. Because now it was filled with meaning. They spent a weekend away in Jeju during a rare break in their schedule. No entourage, no stylists, no obligations, just a rented cabin with creaky floors, wind chimes hanging from the eaves, and the ocean close enough that they could hear its breath at night. They hiked in the early mornings, shared earphones on the trail, stopped for tea in little seaside cafes where no one cared who they were. At night, they sat out under a canopy of stars. Bundled in thick sweaters and shared blankets, they spoke in fragments, about fears, about future dreams, about the versions of themselves they'd lost and the versions they'd reclaimed. At one point, Jungkook asked, "Do you think we'll always be this close?" Taehyung didn't answer immediately. He watched the stars instead. "Then I think closeness isn't about distance. It's about memory. Even if we grow apart one day, I'll still carry you in my skin." Jungkook swallowed hard. "That's the most romantic thing you've ever said to me." Taehyung laughed. "I've been saving it." They returned to Seoul quietly, recharged, different. The next few weeks were a blur of stages, travel, rehearsals, but something about their presence together was different now. Centered, grounded. Taehyung no longer hesitated to reach out mid-song. Jungkook no longer flinched when their eyes met in front of thousands. And during one particular show, just before the lights dimmed, Taehyung turned to Jungkook and whispered over the roar of the crowd, "You're my favorite part of the noise." Jungkook didn't respond with words. He just smiled, slow and real, and full of everything he hadn't known how to say for years. Later, when the photos from that night went viral, of Taehyung looking at Jungkook like the world had disappeared, of Jungkook smiling at him like he'd just come home, people speculated like they always did. But the ones who knew, the ones who had followed from the very first untagging, through the silence, the archive, the rooftop, the rain, they didn't need explanations. They had seen the truth unfold, one small act at a time. Not a story that demanded attention, but one that deserved to be remembered. And above all, one that would never again be untagged.